Hi everyone, it's Dr. Marks, and we're still in our introduction to Costa Rica, but now we're going to turn our attention to the changing composition of the Costa Rican economy. So how has the economy transformed over time? Costa Rica historically has been an agricultural nation. Now, they're still involved in agriculture today, just like the United States is involved in agriculture, but it's not the backbone of their economy. But one thing I want you to understand is that Costa Rica's focus on the environment comes after much damage. So while they're now a leader in sustainability, we need to understand that historically they did quite a bit of devastation to their country, and it was only through those lessons that they learned how to protect their environment. This is a country that saw great deforestation. And why? Same story you hear all over the world. They wanted to make way for farms and for ranches because at the time this was something that really added to their economy. Also, logging played a major role, and we'll talk more about that later. But if we look at the data suggests that in the 1940s, Costa Rica had lots of indigenous forests. 75% of Costa Rica was covered in indigenous forest. It didn't take very long, however, to decimate this. And just a few decades later, by 1983, only 26% of this indigenous forest remained. So they decreased it by 75% of what had been forested. So they really learned their lessons. So the Costa Rica that we see now comes after much devastation. What that also means is when we're going to be trekking, we're not going to be in primary forest most of the time. We're going to be most likely in secondary forest. Again, more on this topic later, and we'll be turning our attention to the environment in this class fairly soon, but we do need to get through the economic stuff first. You need to understand the economy to be able to understand what it is you're seeing when you're there. Costa Rica's economy has absolutely transformed, and it's no longer mainly agricultural. Historically, yes, definitely agriculture, but not what we see today. What we see today has much diversification, and you're going to get a good sense, and we'll look at some data so you can get a sense of this diversification that has been created. That means when they're moving out of agriculture, they're moving towards production of higher valued goods. And you're going to see that when you can be involved in, for example, medical instrument manufacturing, that is a product that is higher valued than, let's say, bananas, clearly, right? And so this is good. We also see an expansion of the services sector, going from agriculture, transforming more towards services and manufacturing. Now, I would love to be able to find just production information on what the economy is producing, the composition of gross domestic product, and I am not finding that in a way that I can make heads or tails out of it in terms of presenting it to you. But I would love to be able to break down GDP across all of their different industries. But as I said, it's not available in the detail that I want so that I can really show you the points I want to make. So instead, I'm going to use a good approximation in exports, right? The things that you export show those things that you are focusing on. So if we look at Costa Rica's exports, we'll get a good sense on their comparative advantages, what they're specializing in, right? So focusing on exports helps us understand a lot about production. Again, as I just said, that means it's going to represent a country's comparative advantage. And your comparative advantages are those things that you specialize in. For example, the United States has comparative advantages in cars and trucks. We have comparative advantages in pharmaceuticals, in sports equipment, in entertainment. And if you look at our exports, we export that stuff all over the world. And those are just some examples. So we're going to be talking about exports. Where does Costa Rica choose to focus their attention and their resources, and how does that translate into what they export? So what we're going to do specifically is look at exports over time, and we're going to track those exports over time, and we're going to think about it as kind of a bundle, and we're going to see how that bundle of goods has changed. And by doing that, that's going to allow us to track the changes in the economy. So get ready for us to look at some data, and you'll get a sense of what I'm trying to do, give you kind of a visual so that you can get a sense of how Costa Rica's priorities have changed. All right. Let's take a look at Costa Rican exports in 1962. And this is a fantastic tool, by the way, that you can create these kinds of visuals. And so please understand what we're looking at. In the black bar, it says the total is $82.2 million. And we're not going to track dollar values. We've already shown that exports have gone up in dollar value. Instead, what we want to do is look at the composition. And the composition is broken down for us into categories. And what we want to focus on is the percent. Well, what do we see in 1962? What is the backbone of the Costa Rican economy? What is the biggest focus for them in terms of exports? Well, it's coffee. Look at that. 57% of the value of all exports comes from coffee. And look at number 2. Bananas. So coffee and bananas together, right, makes up more than 3/4 of the export value. And then trailing behind it, cocoa beans, sugarcane, meat. You get the idea. In 1962, how would you describe the Costa Rican economy? It's definitely agricultural, right? They're not producing good manufacturing products that they're selling around the world like medical instrumentation or electronics or anything like that. It's purely agriculture. Let's talk about coffee, since that was such an important part of the Costa Rican economy. So in the 1960s, as we just said, the biggest focus for Costa Rica is agriculture, and we just showed that using some data. We said coffee was number 1, bananas is number 2. Coffee is significantly bigger than bananas, but together they made up more than 3/4 of the exports, right? Coffee in Costa Rica took off in the late 1700s. So Costa Rica has been involved in coffee for a very long time. Where is it that Costa Rica produces coffee? Well, in the Costa Rican Central Valley, and you're going to get a good sense of this because we'll be going to the Central Valley. So in Costa Rica's Central Valley, they start specializing in coffee. Why there? Well, you've got fertile soil, you've got a good climate because it's in the mountains. Coffee doesn't want super hot temperatures. It likes a little bit of elevation. And so in the mountains of Costa Rica, you can see coffee farms that have been just cut into the mountains in kind of a terraced farming manner. Well, to expand this industry, what does Costa Rica do? They start giving land to coffee farmers back in the 1800s. Well, let's think about that for a second. If you want to grow coffee, and you've got a bunch of forested land, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to be cutting down trees. Back then, they're not talking about things like shade-grown coffee. That's more of a newer development. So coffee came in the 1700s, and the government's trying to encourage coffee production because this is a way to really stimulate export strength. And so they give land away to coffee farmers. They want people producing coffee. If you look at the map on the left, you can see the Central Valley region. Right there in the center, you see that red arrow pointed to it. But now compare it to the map on the right. This is the relief map that shows that mountain range. So where is coffee being grown? In the Central Valley, in the mountains, right? In the mountains. So coffee likes that higher elevation. Coffee was exported to other Central American nations. So it went from Costa Rica to other parts of Central America. And then it was branded for sale in England. So the coffee made its way from Costa Rica to the other Central American nations, where it was then kind of packaged and branded and shipped to England. And until World War II, England was the largest recipient of Costa Rican coffee. Now today, you can get Costa Rican coffee, and it's at specialty shops. You can get it at a coffee shop, for example. But back then, England was getting the bulk of Costa Rican coffee. The approach now is different. We see a different approach in Costa Rica. Instead of quantity, they focus on quality. So their focus for Costa Rica is high quality, and they're not looking at quantity. You can go to other parts of Central America and South America, and you can see focus on quantity, just large volumes of coffee. But instead, Costa Rica is looking at just really high coffee. And this is how Costa Rica set itself apart from all of those high volume coffee exporting nations. For example, Colombia. Colombia is a huge exporter of coffee. Costa Rica is not going to be able to compete with Colombia on volume. So why even try? Instead, Costa Rica should do what Colombia is not doing, and that is focusing on really, really high quality, in a sense, boutique coffee. So this is how Costa Rica set itself apart from all of those other coffee producing nations that are just pumping out as much production as they can. The focus in Costa Rica has been on Arabica coffee. And so you're going to hear about that probably if we're visiting a coffee farm on your particular itinerary, which we usually do. Others were growing Robusta coffee. So Arabica and Robusta, they're not the same quality. Robusta is more likely going to be used for something like instant coffee. And when you think about instant coffee, you're not thinking about, oh my gosh, really high quality, right? Nobody says, oh my God, I'm dying for an instant coffee. It's also used in cheaper blends, so it might be mixed with some other things to create kind of your cheaper things like Folgers, those things that you can buy in a can right on the shelf in your grocery store, kind of the lower end blend. So that's going to be Robusta coffee. But Arabica, higher end coffee, and that's what Costa Rica specialized. There actually has been a ban in place in Costa Rica for Robusta coffee. They didn't allow anybody to grow it because it's the lower quality type of coffee. So the government actually regulated to keep farmers from growing the Robusta coffee. Interestingly, in my reading, it appears that Costa Rica in around 2021 was working on a plan to lift this ban, but only to some degree. So they're starting to look a little bit more at Robusta coffee, but historically they haven't. There's some areas where Robusta coffee might grow better. So those are the areas where they might be lifting the ban just a little bit to allow this diversity. Instead of just saying everyone has to be in Arabica coffee, some farmers might be allowed to grow Robusta coffee. But the bottom line, as we saw in that graphic, right, that infographic that we showed, coffee was the #1 export in terms of dollar value. And it stayed that way for several decades. So it was all about coffee. And if you're tying your economy to coffee, it might make sense that you're encouraging development of coffee farms. However, as you can imagine, trees are being cut down to make way for this kind of farming, right? Let's look at 1962, where coffee is our main export, our #1 export, and then it's bananas and cocoa beans and cane sugar. And now let's go just 20 years later to 1982. So we're going to compare the top half versus the bottom half. 20 years later in 1982, what do you notice? What's the #1 export now? Bananas, right? And coffee's #2. So by 1982, coffee is no longer the #1 export, right? It's no longer the #1 export in value. It has moved to bananas. Now again, still agriculture, right? Because look, we've got bananas #1, coffee #2, then we've got bovine, so meat related stuff. But we're starting to see some other developments. Look at the right side. We've got lingerie and footwear, and then we're starting to get into other types of products, but just small portions of our overall exports. But take a look at the top half. Coffee's #1, bananas are #2, but together, if you add 57% and 21%, that gives us 78%. 78% of export value is in coffee and bananas. But now let's look at 1982. Is that still true? If I add bananas and coffee together, bananas is #1, coffee's #2, so they've switched places, but together they only comprise 55% of exports. All right, so by 1982, 20 years later, coffee's not number one, and agriculture seems to be shrinking a bit, right, as a percentage share of export value. Let's talk about bananas. Bananas are associated with Central America, right? If you go buy bananas at any grocery store, often they have a little sticker telling you where they're from, and you're going to see that they come from Central America. A whole lot of bananas are produced there. But interestingly, they actually originated in Asia. But bananas were brought to Central America by the Spanish. So that's how Central America started becoming a banana producing region. Now in Costa Rica, these bananas were planted along the newly constructed railways. So you start developing the railways for transportation, you're planting all these bananas along the way. The first banana plantation was actually formed in 1872. And again, just like with coffee, the government wanted to expand into this industry. So again, what do? They start giving land concessions and incentives, but this time to foreign companies, right? With coffee, they did the same thing, but they were giving probably locals, coffee farmers, the land. Here they're giving land concessions and incentives to foreign companies to start developing these banana industries in Costa Rica. So what does that mean? What are they doing? They're encouraging foreign direct investment, right? Hey, other countries, invest in this banana industry, set up shop here, and we will hook you up. Maybe we give you land or free taxes. We give you incentives to develop here in Costa Rica. The first banana company merged with Boston Fruit Company, and that became the famous United Fruit Company. And there's a whole lot of history related to the United Fruit Company in this part of the world. The United Fruit Company actually held a monopoly in bananas till the 1950s. So think about it. What do we know about a monopoly? A monopoly is when you have one major producer with very limited competition, right? So United Fruit Company was the banana monopolist until the 1950s. But now we see bananas being dominated by U.S. brands in Costa Rica. For example, we've got Chiquita, and Chiquita is formerly United Fruit, but now we see Chiquita, we see Del Monte, we see Dole, and you can be driving around in Costa Rica in the areas that produce bananas and see like a banana processing plant. You can just drive, right up to it. We've actually shown up at some and asked if we could look around. So you can see lots of facilities for Chiquita, for Del Monte, for Dole, all there. And again, Chiquita is formerly the United Fruit Company, this former monopolist. The bulk of production in bananas is on the Caribbean side. Now, the Caribbean side is going to be the East Coast. So you see my arrow there pointed to the map. And sometimes we go to the Caribbean side, sometimes we stay on the Pacific side, depending on the itinerary for the year. But if you want to see a lot of bananas, you've got to really be on the Caribbean side. And then you can find entire plantations. You can find entire large facilities doing nothing but harvesting the bananas, washing the bananas, packaging the bananas for shipment. And most of the bananas that are produced are for export. So again, as we saw in that infographic, bananas became the #1 export, taking over for coffee. The problem is with bananas that consumers want perfect looking bananas, and I'm guilty of that too. I'm going to, fish through the bananas and I want the one with no brown spots and no bruises, and I want it to be perfect. But to get that perfect banana for the consumer, it requires heavy use of pesticides. So unfortunately, this is an industry that brought with it a lot of pesticide use. And of course, pesticide use is going to be a concern in any agricultural industry. Now, with continued development, as we showed, bananas and coffee switched places, but that's only for a little while. we get to the point where bananas and coffee are no longer number 1 and 2. So again, quickly to recap, we started with coffee number 1 and bananas number 2. Then they switched places. Bananas are number 1 and coffee is number 2. And then both of them get displaced as being the top exports for the country. So let's take a look. The top half of this infographic is what we just looked at. This is 1982. Bananas are number 1, coffee's number 2. They've switched places, but again, together they comprise a smaller share of exports than what we saw earlier. Now let's look at the second half, the bottom half, and we see in 2002, so I'm going 20 years later, and number 1 is electronic microcircuits. So 2002, we see a very different type of economy related to their production for exportation, right? We're focusing on electronic. 22% of the export value is electronic microcircuits. And then below that, you see computer parts and accessories, computer peripherals, electrical resistors. It looks like it says, I know it's really small. And bananas has fallen to number 2. And where's coffee? Look at 2002. Where's coffee? Wow, it's fallen way down behind miscellaneous fruits and behind cotton undergarments and lingerie and medical. There's coffee, right? Just 3%. So what conclusions can we make here? By 2002, Costa Rica is no longer an agricultural economy. They are still producing a lot of bananas, but bananas are not number 1. Coffee is just a fraction of what it used to be. And the country's exports is now focusing on more sophisticated goods, electronic microcircuits. Totally different than bananas and coffee, right? So let's talk about electronics for a second. As the infographic we just looked at shows us, we start to see a focus in electronics. Well, in the 1990s, Intel moved to Costa Rica. And I know you know what Intel is. A lot of you have Intel core processors in your computers, right? Well, Intel focuses on the production of microprocessors. Very different from bananas, very different from coffee, right? And this comprises 20% of the country's exports, right, in terms of dollar value. So from 2000 to 2012, for this 12-year period, Intel was so big that it comprised 11% of Costa Rica's foreign direct investment. So look at that again. For a 12-year period, Intel is so big, it has such an impact, that if you look at all of the foreign direct investment that's coming into Costa Rica, Intel represented 11% of that. That is huge, right? So huge focus on microprocessors in Costa Rica. So we see a very different composition of exports. Keep in mind that with Intel and the foreign direct investment coming in, it's bringing with it good jobs and better salaries, higher standards of living. In 2014, unfortunately, Intel announced that it was moving out of Costa Rica, and this was quite a blow. Instead, they were going to relocate these jobs to Asia. You might be thinking, well, why? Well, why do you think? Why are they moving out of Costa Rica and moving jobs to Asia, specifically Malaysia, Vietnam, and China? What might be the advantages of going to Malaysia and Vietnam and China? Likely cheaper labor. So unfortunately, Intel pulls out of Costa Rica. It's a big blow, right? They were responsible for a lot of jobs. They were bringing in a lot of know-how, a lot of financial capital. This is not a good thing. However, the economy still continues to transform. This did not devastate Costa Rica, fortunately. Now let's look at 2016. 2002 is the top half. We see the electronic microcircuits. By 2016, remember, Intel's pulled out and they announced it in 2014. Now we're not in the microprocessor business anymore, right? Instead, Costa Rica is focusing on medical instruments, orthopedic devices, those kinds of things. Are they still involved in agriculture? Of course, because below medical instruments, you see miscellaneous fruit, you still see bananas, you still see coffee. But what's happening? It's shrinking, right? It's shrinking. So medical instrumentation starts to replace what Intel leaves behind in terms of microprocessors. This is what I mean, folks, when I say that the Costa Rican economy has drastically transformed. So now you can see it a little better because I've blown it up. Medical instruments, orthopedic devices. Sure, the yellow part in the left shows we're still involved in fruit. For example, pineapples are a big export. Still involved in bananas, still involved in coffee. But we now see much more diversification, right? This shows it another way. This is another graph. What did Costa Rica export between 1995 and 2012? Well, let's look at that big turquoise section, and that is machinery and electrical. So this is showing us that Costa Rica is still producing vegetable products, right? Look at that yellow, that kind of brighter yellow. Still producing a lot of fruits and vegetables, still involved in agriculture. That's not going away necessarily. It's just shrinking as a proportion. Machinery and electrical are growing. Let's look at the composition of the economy in 2010. We see that Costa Rica has really moved to become a service economy. 66% of the economy is in services. So now I'm able to give you more about kind of gross domestic product as opposed to just exports. So these are just summaries. Services is 66%. Agriculture is only 6.9% at this point. And industry, 26%. So no longer agriculturally focused. Still involved in agriculture for sure, but no longer only primarily an agricultural economy. We can compare that to 2017, and you see it's still continuing to transform. Look at the services sector. Services are expanding, but industry is shrinking, agricultural is shrinking. So we're still seeing this transition away from agriculture, away from manufacturing, and increasing in the service sector. Same kind of conclusion can be made here. This is agricultural as a percent of the country's gross domestic product, and you see it's fairly stable until late 1990s, and then it starts to rapidly decline. If I asked you if Costa Rica is now primarily agricultural, hopefully you tell me no, it's not. It's more of a service economy, and it's got a significant manufacturing component. However, when we're there, you're going to see a lot of agriculture, and especially if we're off the beaten path a bit, if we're in the rural areas, you're going to maybe get a distorted impression because we're not going to spend a whole lot of time in the capital where you're going to see more of the businesses. So keep this in mind as we travel, that what you've learned about the composition of the economy might not necessarily match what we're seeing because our goal is to be there in nature and not in the city. As we just said from our pie charts, expansion of the service sector, we see that here. This is the most recent data I can find for Costa Rica, and this is 2019, and we're still seeing transformation since 2016, which is the data we looked at just a few minutes ago. So just a few years later, 3 years later, there's even more focus on medical instruments, even more focus. And we're seeing even more focus on things like orthopedic appliances. And as we would expect, less on food products. So this transformation is ongoing. Costa Rica is not done. In this changing economy, Costa Rica has attracted a lot of major companies, including Procter & Gamble, Allergan, Hospira, and Baxter Healthcare, right? And those are all in the healthcare products industry. So healthcare and healthcare related products has become big in Costa Rica. At one point, more technology like Intel. We've talked about the fact that they specifically have pulled out, but you're seeing other American chains, Marriott, Hilton, Best Western. Now, my personal view is that when you're traveling in Costa Rica, you don't go to the Marriott, to the Hilton, to the Best Western. You should support businesses that are Costa Rican. It creates a bigger economic footprint, something we'll be talking more about later. You're going to see American restaurants, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Subway, they've all become big. So if you are really craving something like that, you may be able to find it. But the bottom line is these are all examples of foreign direct investment, right? So there has been a lot of foreign direct investment, and we understand why. That we know the country offers a good place to invest internationally, right? Costa Rica offers an educated workforce because we've already talked about their investment in human capital. We know that they have a stable political climate. And they have a good business climate. These are all things we've talked about. But let's add on this idea of this being a country that is not corrupt. We know that's not true in all Central American countries. And I'm not trying to say it's corruption free, not at all what I mean. But there is an organization that has created a corruptions perceptions index. It's Transparency International. And they basically try to measure what kinds of corruption problems countries are having. Costa Rica is ranked 48 out of 180, where number 1 is the best. So this is a really good place to be in terms of your corruptions perceptions index. So it's a country that is not overly corrupt. If you go to some of the Central American counterparts, you're going to find a very different kind of rating. However, the rating has fallen just a little bit for Costa Rica. Another thing that we can measure is the ease of doing business. And the World Bank has created an ease of doing business ranking. How easy is it for you to establish and do business in Costa Rica? Well, Costa Rica is ranked 74 out of 190. That's also not bad. And again, higher is better. Number 1 is the best. This has also fallen just a little bit, but nevertheless, it's a good score, and it's definitely better than some of the other Central American and South American counterparts. For example, I pulled some of the other Central American countries. Honduras ranks 133, Guatemala 96, El Salvador 91, Nicaragua 142, Panama. Remember, Panama is a richer country than Costa Rica, but their rating is a little worse at 86 in terms of their rank, rather. So Costa Rica is a pretty good place to be. Costa Rica also scores high on the Human Development Index and the Social Progress Index. So these are things that suggest that Costa Rica is making investments in its society. They're trying to increase the quality of life for its citizens. Of course, they're investing in education. These are all things that help propel Costa Rica in these indices. And as we know, this has attracted foreign direct investment. We don't need to talk about this much. You've already seen a graph like this, but foreign direct investment goes up and up and up with a few blips, remember, for the Great Recession and the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's recap. We've seen a major transformation in the Costa Rican economy. We still see a lot of agriculture in Costa Rica. You're going to see it a lot as we travel around, but we also understand it's not the same proportion of exports as it used to be. The role of agriculture is clearly diminishing in Costa Rica. So be sure you understand this transformation and understand kind of which direction Costa Rica has headed in. And we've looked at plenty of data to help paint that picture. And we've also discussed reasons why the composition of the economy is changing. And again, it comes down to those things that helps a country propel itself economically: investment in human capital, foreign direct investment, and of course, trade. So let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for listening, and I hope you have a fantastic day.